Okay, I'm just spending a little bit of time going around this again, just with I've got a 120 pad at the moment. I'm just taking any kind of slight imperfections out, but I'm also reintroducing the radius around the edges, because when we hit this with the DA sander, we kind of took that surface level down ever so slightly, which has left a little bit of a hard edge on this radius. So just blending that back in. It's a really quick process, doesn't take long at all. And then I'll just go over that with a 240 pad. And hopefully before too much longer we'll get this ready for undercoat. We're going to go with the same white undercoat that we used on the last Stratocaster. I think that'll look nice as we kind of blend back the red finish, so you'll have kind of little edges of white peeping through. Now, there's been quite a bit of feedback from the last video where I stripped all this off. A number of additional options were explored, things that we could do to make that job a little bit easier. To be honest, I didn't think it was that hard. It took a little bit of time, but it was just a steady process. And as long as you can keep your mind active, it does go quite quickly. One of the things that was suggested that you could stick this in the oven at a certain temperature, and that would loosen off all of that lacquer. Might be an option. It's not really an option for me. Mrs. Shed wouldn't be pleased if I did that. It was also mentioned that I said I was going to be putting brand new shiny hardware onto this guitar once it's assembled, and there was a comment about putting shiny hardware onto a relic guitar. This isn't going to be a heavy relic. I'm not trying to emulate a guitar that's been abandoned in a ditch for 6 months. This is going to be my interpretation of a guitar that's had a lot of use over a long period of time, but essentially has been looked after. So there will be wear to the paint just through use, but all the chrome and everything will be in relatively good condition. If I wanted to, I could kind of dip it in ferric chloride or another acid just to kind of take the shine off the chrome. I could use Scotch-Brite pads or something like that just to dull it all off. I have done that in the past with some good results, but we had the conversation about how far we wanted to take this, and that really wasn't what we were looking for. I did, in a couple of places, put a couple of dings in to the body. There's one just there, I caught it with a scraper. There's a couple more, but they're under the pick guard, so we're not going to worry about those too much. And to be fair, I'm not going to worry about that one either. Once that's painted over, it will look like the guitar's had a little bit of a knock. So I'll leave that one in, kind of a little bit of pre-relicing. But ultimately, as I explained, I want this guitar to look like something that's essentially been looked after, but just had a lot of use. And to that end, we need a decent paint job to start with. If I just painted over this without prepping it properly, we wouldn't have that base to start from. We would just have a crap paint job that we would then make crapper. What I'm aiming to do is have a decent paint job that looks like it's been worn through in places, just through wear. Which means ultimately I've got a bit of sanding to do just to get the surfaces how I want them over kind of 99% of the guitar. Don't mind the odd little ding or chip here because that will add to the effect, but if it was just rubbish paint, it would look wrong for me. So I'm going to carry on sanding, get all these radiuses blended in, and then we can look to getting this over to the paint booth and get some primer onto it. And one thing I'm also doing over both the front and the back of this is around all these edges where we've still got the original lacquer in place, and we're just going to spray it over. I'm just making sure that that edge is really nicely blended in. It's all going to get covered, but it will just give it a nicer transition between the old paint and the new. Okay, so I've just had to hit that with the 120 on the DA again, because there is actually quite a lot of inconsistency in the back of this guitar. Now, some of that was where I've hit it with the scraper, but in this area especially, it wasn't actually that well sanded from the factory, it would appear. There seemed to be a lot of kind of tooling marks, and when they've taken that relief cut out. Now, I did get a couple of comments on the last video that there seemed to be some white patches emerging as I was scraping the finish off. And what was happening there was actually kind of two layers of the finish in play. There was this stuff, which is the actual shiny finish on the top with the sunburst and everything else in it, which was quite hard and brittle. And once you heated it up, it came off quite easily. But underneath that, there was like a really thick layer of this softer material, which was like a sealer and a base coat. And I think that explains why this wasn't kind of as well sanded as it might have been, because I think that thick coating actually filled in some of those inconsistencies, which is why they were able to get what was actually quite a nice finish onto something that wasn't as well sanded as, say, I would do, putting a much thinner nitro finish on. So I've had to go back over it and just take that down a little bit more, but we are where we need to be now. So again, it's just a case of blending in all of these edges on the back, and we're pretty much ready to go then, I think. Okay, so I've given that a good rub down now. I'm pretty confident all the contours now are nice and smooth and back how we wanted them. You might be able to see that there's some white already in here. When I was kind of taking the old finish off, I had kind of dug in a few places with my little scraper. So all I've done is I've just brush painted some of the white primer on, left it for an hour or so to dry up, and then rubbed it down, and that's acted like a little bit of a filler. So all of those little nicks are now pretty much filled in to the point where we'll be able to kind of get a couple of coats of primer onto there and totally fill all those little voids up. So nothing for it now but to get it onto the painting stick, fire it over to the paint booth, and start to get some primer on it. And as we did last time, I've got some of this white primer from Nitrolac and some of their medium solvent. I'm not going to thin it down too much though. I want this to kind of build quite quickly. So I don't really want to be putting more than maybe 2 coats on. So just get some of that into the gun and get the first coat laid down. And if anyone's wondering about the gun that I use, it's basically a cheap generic HVLP gun from Amazon. Cost me about £15, I think. Quite straightforward, nothing complicated. cheap as chips, but works really well. I'm running a 1mm nozzle on this, which is absolutely fine for the kind of work that I do. If I were spraying in a proper spray booth on a regular basis, I would probably invest in a much more expensive gun. But I think given the amount of work that I do with this, probably gets used 4 or 5 times a year. So it's not getting a huge amount of wear. And it works just fine. And the quality of finish that I can apply with it matches the environment that it's being used in. So realistically, if I was to use a much more expensive gun, I wouldn't get any better finish, simply because I don't really have the workspace that would facilitate that. So that's the gun, relatively cheap. I use these 3M masks. I think this actually costs more than the spray gun. I tend to keep these for about 6 months. I don't use them an awful lot. Keep them in a bag when they're not being used. Always give them a bit of a clean out before I put them on, just to make sure I'm not putting anything nasty onto my face. Work really well, filter out all of the nasties that I spray in here. And of course I do have the extractor, which also helps a great deal. I always run the extractor when I'm spraying, and I'll leave it on for about 5 or 10 minutes after I've finished spraying with the door of the shed open. I'll be out of the way. That'll just clear all the fumes and overspray out, and I can come back in and crack on with my work. So safety is important. You need to look after your health. That's a really big part of it, and also kind of getting some ventilation into your workspaces as well. Okay, and there's the primer on this thing. All looks to have gone on very nicely. And the back's looking good too. So I'm going to leave this now for a day or so, just to cure up a little bit, and then we can get it flatted off, get rid of any kind of lumps and bumps on there. There is some unevenness, especially on the radius, where there'll be some just loose fibres that are standing up a little bit. So we'll give this a little bit of time to cure up, and we'll give it a flat off, and then we can think about getting some colour onto it, which is very exciting. But that's all going to be for the next episode, so I'm going to leave this one here. So as always, don't forget to hit that like button if you've enjoyed this, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Thanks a lot for watching. Bye bye.